IT procurement for BP, where we co-developed kind of the product, Contract AI, and we're going to talk a little bit about that journey here, as well as kind of focus on what are the pitfalls, what are the things to look at when you're dealing with AI and working on kind of transformative programs. I'll introduce you now, or let Nick introduce himself. Nick Wright from BP.
I thought you were going to do it for me, Mike. I thought you'd save me a job there. So yeah, Nicholas Wright. I look after procurement innovation for BP. That's the current role. So the role is very much involved with evaluating new procurement technologies and what we do with our people and our process in relation to those tools. So as you're probably all aware, there's lots of new technologies on the market, doing lots of different things. So one of my roles is how do we bring those into BP and make the most of those. Previous to that, I looked after digital and innovation sourcing, so led the teams that were in the market buying all of BP's digital and innovation services.
Great, thanks, Nick. Unlike a lot of talks and webinars, I think we're going to just try to really lean into the details and not just kind of talk at a high level of buzzwords of we did this and we did that and it was all great and things like that. Well, let's just pull I'm going to look and watch the chat. You guys can lean in on some questions as well. Kind of what we're here to do today is kind of talk about can AI realistically help legal operations or your business, and cover a few things. I think we kind of share the journey that we've had around AI and BP, and so a real world example, and then we can kind of talk about some, what are some things that lessons learned that we have through our journeys and digital transformation and AI transformation. So like one of the things in the abstract we kind of talked about is there's some common misconceptions of AI in the marketplace, and one of the things is, I think the first thing is everything's AI, right? If you don't have AI, even if you're not doing AI, you're not an innovative product. So I think AI is such an overused and broad term now. It means something different to everyone. So I think you have to focus in on what exactly you're buying or looking into. The other thing is a misconception I kind of see is people think that when they talk about AI, they either think it's on one hand snake oil and on the other hand Terminator 2 or the Matrix, and the reality is it's somewhere in the middle, right? But I see it's very polarized in people's opinion of it. And as we kind of talk about things here today, I mean, Colin and I were briefly talking before this call that I look at what is AI, and I look at how do you make that like consumable for folks. And one of the things I always say is that it's like AI is something that you could teach a 10-year-old child to do, right? But you could do it at scale, like 1,000 10-year-old children, where they can do things within guardrails of what you've instructed them to do, and they can do it very well. But you get outside of that, and then they need more learning and more training to be able to do that. So I don't know if that's a great analogy or not, but that's kind of how I look at it and how I try to kind of explain that sometimes to folks.
So Mike, you coined the phrase, and I hope you're going to drop this in. What AI isn't. Can you just share that, because I think it's brilliant.
I think a lot of people think AI is another individual, and
that's the one
doing the work behind the scene. And I think when you guys are looking at AI companies, I think when you ask about their AI, you can really kind of tell whether they actually are doing AI or not. Because if you engage somebody that does AI, like AppWorkin, folks will talk at length and ad nauseum about AI and their models and their approach and how we're using these multiple different layers of getting at the information and data, and they'll go on for hours and ad nauseum. Other folks that says, oh yeah, we use machine learning and NLP and that's the end of it, probably aren't doing AI. I mean, that's kind of the litmus test. So when you find folks that really want to talk and go deep about it, they're probably using AI. If they're just kind of throwing the buzzwords around, probably not. So I don't know. I think I need to trademark that or copyright that. Maybe ask the legal folks to kind of help me with what the appropriate coinage of that term should be in the future. But what we wanted to do is, like, that being said, let's kind of jump into like a real world example. So Nick, like what were some of the problems we were trying to solve at BP, and why we engaged in using kind of we went down that AI path? Maybe you could share with us some of those things.
So I mean, the primary use case was we buy a lot of goods and services at BP. A lot of organizations do, and simply the time it took us to put contracts in place for those goods and services is just way too long. On average, we'd budget 3 to 6 months for a medium-sized deal. For something big and enterprise level, multi-$100 million deal, sometimes longer. And what that meant is the business wanted to move faster than we could allow for. They didn't get all of the stuff that was going on in the background, all of the negotiations and back and forth. They just wanted the product. And what that led to is the perception of procurement as just being archaic, just being slow, overly complicated, and not very supportive of that business strategy. And it's probably a common perception of procurement in general, I think. So the other issue that we had is, we're a global company, so we've got lots of people in different places doing that sourcing and contracting, or contracting more specifically, and the skill set across those locations and within each individual team, it varied. So it was a cottage industry, making sure we had the right people with the right capabilities doing the right levels of deals. And we got burnt a couple of times because in the past we've judged deals by deal size, so how much are we spending with suppliers, but more and more we were finding it's the small deals but were highly critical that we'd perhaps not assigned the right level of capability to, that were just getting lost in the system. So ultimately that was the problem. It was being able to meet the pace that the business wanted us to go at within procurement.
Yeah, I remember one thing that was kind of shared with me was that that really cut to my core when I was there, was that that we were procurement and legal were seen as a barrier to innovation because it was taking so long. So I know when we first started out, it was like, well, I really took that to heart, and of course in my kind of competitive nature, I was like, well, let's put together something that will do this in such a fashion and so fast that they will be the barrier to innovation. And that's kind of where I think we started out. And Nick, I'll just kind of share some of my findings when we were there. Like, we spent a lot of time understanding what was taking so long, right? I think you first have to look at the problem and define it and understand the problem that you're trying to solve. That's probably one of the key things. And I remember kind of looking at what people were working on, and I would say like 80% of their time was focused on the typical terms and conditions, and about 20% of the time was kind of focused on statements of work, articulation of requirements, deliverables, milestones, etc. And what we kind of noticed was, all the disputes came from the area that we're spending, the least amount of time. And so I think that was key for us, is to actually, how do we actually not necessarily, get rid of individuals, but how do we get people to stop working on the 80% and the T's and C's and actually focusing more on the 20%? How do we squeeze that balloon back to the point where we actually get disputes and find the risk actually to the company? I mean, that was my recollection. And I think it was, yourself, Jason, myself, we were kind of looking at, what if we actually could create a tool that could, eliminate red lines, and a counterparty could negotiate their own
Mm.
tool on their own. I mean, that was the like what if, right? That's the what if that we started with.
I think also, Mike, consistency was something that we struggled with. Making sure that people took the same risk positions in certain places consistently across the board, that just didn't happen. And depending on what side of bed someone got up on, would define how willing they were to agree to these red lines. And for us running a global company, that was an issue as well.
Yeah, and I think for the legal audience here, I mean, I think most large enterprises are similar in the fact that they can't have legal advice on every contract that goes through. So a lot of them kind of follow some rules and playbooks. But especially when you start talking about like cyber risk or something like that, it isn't the large companies where your risk is really held. Now it's the smaller companies. I remember looking at some of the things that in some of the large enterprises. It isn't the large enterprise that I would say evildoers are attacking. It's actually the smaller folks that may have connections into those large enterprises. That's where the risk actually is, and that's also where we kind of saw there's an imbalance of how do you like help legal actually have a broader view and control the risk that's in those contracts, even if they're smaller. Would you say that was true at BP as well, Nick?
It's definitely true. I mean, we've got a playbook, and that gives you an acceptable range of things that people can and can't agree to. But that's kind of, it's not always that black and white. We can't spoon feed in exact language everything that people can and can't agree to, because there's always going to be a bit of grey in any negotiation. That's the point of it. And what we also couldn't do, as you've just mentioned, is we can't have every single person going to our legal team for every single query, because they'd just be inundated. So again, back to the consistency, what that meant is people were taking inconsistent decisions when it comes to risk. Pick up one contract, and they may have a massive changes in the warranties or indemnity section. Pick up another, exactly the same risk profile, so they should be the same, but they're vastly different. And from a global perspective, that wasn't great, and that was a problem we were trying to solve for as well.
So kind of getting into the AI of the solution, that whole idea of what if we could eliminate red lines and let counterparties negotiate their own contract with BP. The first thing we stumbled on was what would be actually acceptable for a tool to actually negotiate with a supplier or a counterparty, and that's where we really had to deliver the AI function of the product, which was we said, well, let's look at our historical contracts and actually see where do we actually end up. So everybody's got their templates, their fallback positions. Maybe they have a clause library, maybe they don't. But I think actually understanding where they end up was a question that we had to solve in order to figure out, well, did we like where we ended up, and is that something we want to do for the future? So we kind of look at using the history to actually inform the future, right? So that was where we had to deploy our AI tools to actually kind of read the old contracts and understand the positions that we ended up with, and that's where we started to create what we would call like the smart templates and dynamically create a clause library built off like what we've done in the past and curate that to create those variances and that smart template for the tool to allow for those options to be proposed for a supplier to negotiate.
Yeah, and just to jump in there, Mike, the way I put it, the AI helped us ingest literally hundreds of previously signed contracts and analyze where we'd made deviations to our template, And what we did is we based the most common deviations, or we created clause options from the most common deviations, and provided those to the suppliers to pick from in terms of the automated redlining process. And that gave us real legitimacy in, if there isn't an option for you to pick from as a supplier, more often than not, no one's ever asked for that to be changed before. And for us, that helps us more resiliently go back. So if a supplier is saying, well, you know, your tool's useless and it doesn't give me an option to change this because I really want to change it, the guys can go back and say, you know what, no one's asked to change that in the last 200 times we bought this similar goods or services. So, you know, we're going to keep it like it is. So, you know, I wouldn't underplay the significance of that AI in terms of, you know, the philosophy of the tool.
No, I think it's great to be able to have the data behind you during negotiations to say, you know what, 1,000 other suppliers have signed up for this. Why can't you? That's a really strong negotiating platform to really start from. And this is kind of the first time that, you know, we were able to really see like the performance of clauses and our templates. You know, are we asking for something that's, you know, massive overreach that we never get? I know I had another customer that they had 2 clauses that 100% of the time they were struck from their agreements, and 100% of the time our customer, you know, accepted that deletion. And then you look at the clause and it was such a massive overreach, you're kind of like, why is it even in there? And so, like, you know, I kind of had a chat with them that, you know, if I read that, that means that if I saw something like that in there, that means like, where else is there, you know, demons hiding within the words? You know, I've got to really go through this and actually read it in a way that I have to assume that the worst is going to come from it. So you know, having things like that in your contracts actually cause more red lines, cause more delay and longer events. So that's, you know, just understanding where you end up and what clauses are performing well and what clauses, you know, aren't performing so well. I mean, you might find that everybody accepts a position that maybe you can ask for something a little bit more, but you can actually start to understand what is the market for your company on, you know, your contractual terms. Really, you can almost benchmark yourself and the team and how they're doing.
I think it's having the data. So, you know, we've got legal practitioners on the call, legal operations. How many times have you read a clause and just know it doesn't feel right? So I love the word overreach, like you used there. You know, it was a bit of a reach. So you go back to the supplier and you say, you know, no, I'm not comfortable with this because X, Y, and Z. But what the tool provides us with is tangible data to go back and say, no, it doesn't feel right, and no one's ever asked for this before. And for me, that gives so much weight, so much more weight to that discussion than the gut feel that we would previously have had to go by.
So Nick, we did something kind of what I think is pretty cool is actually we kind of scored and kind of gamified the negotiation process. And, you know, these deviations that we discovered from our, you know, from our templates and our clauses, you know, that were acceptable to us, right? We went through and we obviously found some things that weren't so good in there. But, you know, the ones that we wanted to move forward with, some had a certain amount of risk compared to the other, compared to, you know, our original language. And what we did was we actually started putting points associated to those, and we used a 100-point scale. Because what we first started out was we wanted a 400-point scale, if I remember correctly. And but then I was like, well, is 300 points good? Is 200? Is 0 good? Like, what's actually good? But we settled on a kind of a 100-point scale because it's very easy to explain a 100-point scale to a customer and a supplier so they both understand what that scale means. And, you know, when we first started out, I was like, well, we don't do business with people that are C, D, or E players. So, you know, keep your points, you know, less than 20. Like, we only want to deal with the A and B players. What was also novel is that we, you know, basically allowed the supplier to look at, you know, we gave them the cheat sheet. Here's what's acceptable to us, but there's risk, associated with each of these changes. So as a supplier is looking at this, they can look at the document, but you can also control, where they're negotiating. So, I'll make a very bold statement here that's been proven by data and the number of things that we've done with our clients is that, Microsoft Word is not necessarily, the best tool for negotiating anymore, right? I think it's served its purpose, but I think that there is, I'll make the bold statement that there is a better way to negotiate than handing somebody a document and saying, please mark this up as much as you'd like. And thank you very much. And when can you give me all your markups?
How many times have we had it, where we've done that, and you wait 4 weeks, and what you get back is literally every word has changed, and then you're back to square one. You're back to sending the template out, and these things. This is why some of the negotiations prior to the tool went on 6, 7, 8, 9 months.
And what we've done here is like the negotiations happen through the tool. So, areas where we don't see, large amounts of negotiation, we just don't open those areas for negotiation or grammar changing and things, non-value add. We only open up the areas that where we see negotiation and where we want to get, quick agreement. But we're offering, the counterparty, in this case, the supplier, win-win options, basically. So these are things that, statistically that have, BP has signed up over the past couple of years. These are the things where they've ended up. So it isn't like for every negotiation item, it isn't an iterative process of here's my overreach, and then here's my compromise, and then here's my further overreach. It's basically just cutting to the chase and saying, here's what's acceptable. And on a risk-based scale, you're able to select the option that works best for the supplier. Nick, I think, that's kind of an interesting thing and very different. So, I feel like you have to kind of tell people like a big change like that. What is it? You have to tell somebody 7 times for them to start to kind of understand that. But I think the big question here is, what do the suppliers think of this method of negotiating?
So I'm going to be honest. The suppliers love it in general. Vast majority, I'd say 90%, react favorably. And we're on hundreds of completed deals through the tool, and suppliers signed up to use it. In the early days, there was some skepticism. I think there was some reluctance to work with the tool. And, you can almost boil it down to the same 2, 3, 4 questions that the suppliers ask. And it's, what if I want to change a clause that doesn't let me? And to the previous conversation that we have, there's a really good answer to that. And it's most likely that no one's ever had to ask for that previously. And the chances of that happening are, it's happened, but very, very rarely. The other questions that they ask are, wow, how long have I got to do this? And generally, and we'll come on to the time savings a bit later, but we generally give them 10 days, 10 working days, which is 2 weeks. And generally the reaction to that is, well, we can't get a contract done in 2 weeks. No way, can you set it for 2 months, please? And then we explain how the tool works and the expediency of it. And in general, they agree. And a lot of our suppliers actually complete it sooner than the time limit that we set them in the tool. So you can almost predict what the suppliers initially push back on, but in doing so, it allows us to come back more resiliently with our answers. And very rarely have we ever had a supplier that just flatly refuses to use it. In a competitive RFP situation, we make it really clear to them, this is BP's standard way of doing contracting. So if you want a seat at the table, if you want to compete in this RFP, then you need to go through the tool. And it's a lot easier to manage that conversation with the competitive element. If they're pushing back and they're a sole source supplier, which we use it also for sole source or sole source deals, it's a little bit of a different dynamic. And in some cases, we need to spend a little bit more time with the supplier, building their confidence on how to use the tool. But in general, the reaction has been very, very favorable. It saves them time as much as it saves us time.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten some feedback from some of your customers have reached out to, some of your suppliers have reached out to me to say, how that was, a great process and so different. But, that also that it took them a little bit of time to say, so are you saying if I select this option here and this option and I keep my points in this range, we can beat a contract tomorrow?
Mm.
That was always kind of a, oh, well, okay. But why we think we have something here is we're reducing something for the time to contract for customers, and we're reducing the time to pursuit for suppliers. And that's something that we really haven't seen much in this industry, where it's usually you must use my tool and follow my process even if it's horrible, right? Because this is what it is. But it's something actually where we're just kind of cutting to the chase, and we're going to stop saber rattling and actually focus on the things that actually are successful more for both companies. And that really is spending the time to actually figure out what you want to buy and writing it down, right? And articulating those requirements.
I just would add, I'll just build on that, Mike. I think one thing that's helped the tool remain successful within BP is we ask the suppliers, we send them a survey at the end of every deal. What was your experience? What didn't you like? What did you like? And we take that qualitative and quantitative feedback, and we act on it. And when I say we, it's more like you guys. And I think that's a benefit of working with a small, nimble. Well, I don't know if you're small anymore, Mike. Probably not, because I know it's come on a long way. But a more agile organization like AppOrchid, because some of the ideas that the suppliers had were really good, actually, and some stuff that we had neglected to think about. So where we saw feedback that was a good idea, we just fed that to you guys in AppOrchid, and it was put into the backlog. And weeks later, it appeared on the platform for the benefit of every other supplier. So I think it's that continual evolution mindset that helped the continued success of the tool and the supplier perception.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes kind of the way that we've gone about this approach of kind of co-developing and kind of this agile approach to taking in feedback and maneuvering the product where it needs to go, not necessarily where it's thought that it needs to go within a vacuum, right? To be able to kind of take feedback and then turn that into the next release very quickly, I think is something that's been fun, and something that I've never really personally been a part of, is something that could be so agile and change so quickly. It's not something that ends up onto a and in 2 years time we'll add it to the roadmap and we'll add it then. We've got a couple of questions here, so let's take a couple of these. Brian, you asked about the snake oil. I think the snake oil, what I was meaning was AI beating another individual in a low cost location, actually doing the work and saying it's AI. And I think that was what I was trying to highlight there. Diana, best estimates for setting up. How long does it take to set up? It kind of varies. I'll be honest with you. It kind of varies on the number of documents, the number of categories of spend that you're looking to undertake, right? So I always encourage people to start small and expand. It isn't something that you don't have to boil the ocean. But it's you kind of start where you know that you have a problem and something that you want to solve, and start pulling that information in, and as well as having stakeholders that are really want to receive that information and do something with it. But I think the estimates, I mean, for us, something like that, a couple categories to spend, we're probably usually looking at somewhere around an 8 to 12 week time frame. So that's pretty. It can be faster for sure, but it's somewhere in that 8 to 12 week time frame. Colin has brought up a couple of different things. Change management. I mean, I think it's I think we started and created an MVP of this tool probably in 6 months, but the change, you can't underestimate the change management hurdle that you have to go through in a large enterprise. Especially as something like what we're doing is we're really changing the way that we've done contracting for at least as long as I've been in my career, and so contracting's been around a lot longer than I have. So really kind of changing the way that things are done. There is definitely a change management component, and it shouldn't be underestimated. So you need a strong stakeholder that's willing to go through that change and help everyone through that change. And it does take time. I don't know, Nick, if you want to speak a little bit about that, the actual experience at BP.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions around similar themes from Colin and Jonathan. I think one of the biggest challenges for us was adoption, and you could have the best tool in the world, but if people aren't empowered to use it and comfortable with using it, then they're going to go back to their old ways and sending the contracts out manually, or they're not going to be very resilient. And if we start, let's say, a negotiation in the tool, and the supplier doesn't like it and they want to take it offline, if the individual isn't comfortable with the tool, then they're going to be more inclined to say yes. So adoption is a big thing that we had to continually work on. And it kind of flows into the really good question actually from Jonathan, and in terms of change management and perception of the tool. The tool came in at a very opportunistic time within BP. It really scaled up when we shrank as a company, and we reinvented ourselves towards our low carbon aims. And as part of that reinvention, we rewired the company from left to right, top to bottom, and we lost about 10,000 people overnight almost, while still having to do the same amount of work. So that's really the gap that the tool filled in terms of people. However, for those people that were left, the value of the tool and the way that we increased adoption and maintained that adoption is really simple. And we let the tool take care of the boring, the T's and C's. Let the tool do that for you, and you can then be free to add value in the more artistic descriptions of scope of services and commercials and service levels, and the things that really matter in a deal, and the things that we really need your expertise on, rather than spending 3 weeks discussing some obscure terms and conditions. You can use your expertise on actually crafting a beautiful statement of work that everyone's going to be able to read, and it's going to protect the organization. So that was one angle that we shared with the tool, and that really helped. If people understood the purpose of the tool and what it freed them up to do, it was really helpful. So and that also helped with the overall change management and the success that we had in scaling the tool out.
And maybe something here we can talk about, since we have a large legal audience, Nick, is, I think one of the problems we had was anytime from, when kind of some of the more junior members, anytime they received a contract that had red lines in it, it was just kind of flip it over the wall to legal. And, that was not very well received from legal as well. And I think one of the things the tool has done is taken that, I guess the rudimentary questions that they would typically get, and it's solved within the tool. And so now our legal and our external legal is only working on the things on the edge, right? The where we actually need that horsepower, because we didn't have enough horsepower for them to deal with every change that that should be able to be handled from another group. We just didn't have that across all our regions, so we didn't have that legal horsepower.
It's a good point, and the way we're set up in BP, procurement practitioners for 99% of the time are the negotiators. I know in some organisations you have legal actually being the negotiators as well as the together with the commercial teams, but in BP that was slightly different. And procurement practitioners are skilled in procurement, not necessarily legal, and they've not been through the detailed and years of legal training that our legal department would have had, yet they were still required to interpret clauses from a legal perspective. So one thing the tool has been really, really helpful in doing is augmenting that those situations where we have to sign on the supplier's T's and C's because it's a unique service. We can't get it from anywhere else, and the supplier doesn't want to use our template. And what App Orchid have been able to build for us is some analytics that will not so much on supplier paper, although I believe it exists, Mike. I think you've got that working as a feature. But if a contract has been negotiated outside of the tool, so manual red lines, and you're at the point of just about to sign it, what the tool will do for us is analyze it using its AI and give us a contractual risk of, you shouldn't really be agreeing to that clause because it's too risky based on, the template rules. And really that's been a godsend, because ordinarily those contracts may have been sent to legal for review prior to the signing. And now, within probably about 5 seconds, the tool's using its AI, it's scanning it, it's comparing it to both our templates and the clause options that we allow suppliers to select from if they had have done it in the tool. And it will give us a risk score and tell us whether we should sign it or not, or whether we should go back to the drawing board. So for us, that really takes the pressure off the engagement with legal. It doesn't negate it, but what it does is free our legal teams up to work on the more strategic deals, the more highly complex strategic deals, partnership deals, things that are really going to turn the dial for BP, rather than the transactional, run-of-the-mill contracts.
No, I think that's a good point. I think I also stress the audit and compliance fact of being able to go back and understand, where the risk is in your contracts that exists, as well as when like legal and regulatory terms change, you can see which contracts you need to look at instead of having to look at all of them, right? And which contracts were written against which templates and again against which language, and it gives you just from that life cycle being able to manage that in a much more efficient way, that instead of I got to go look at all my contracts to go see which ones have GDPR language in that or this clause from GDPR. So I think that's that's massively helpful as well, and it gives a view that we've never been able to really have before in the procurement and legal world of where's the risk in our existing contracts.
And how many times have we had a fire drill or some sort of last minute exercise to say some legislation has changed and we need to go back and look at all of 200, hundreds of contracts in a particular category spend. And the way we've done that previously is just people. We've got people in to Control F in Word, look for certain words or patterns or phrases, and then manually, record those details somewhere. And this is where App Orchid's been a real game changer for us, because we can aggregate those hundreds of contracts together in a zip file either give it to App Orchid or manually ingest it into the tool, and it will do that work of tens of people in seconds, and it'll give us those analytics and those risk positions, and it will tell us if it's found something in a contract that means the same but is worded differently. And for me, that's a really crucial point of the AI. And some of the other tools that we were looking at really were like automating that Control F in Word and just looking for specific strings. And if things were worded differently but meant the same thing, the system wouldn't be smart enough to recognize that. And I think someone mentioned about AI and what is the true value of AI. And for me, that's a huge selling point. To be able to differentiate between things that mean the same but may look differently or use different words is massive.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to sum that up, it's turned what used to be projects into business as usual, right? So you don't have to spin up a huge project with a bunch of people. It's a query through the tool, and it gives you that augmentation, right, of in your role to be able to answer those things without having to then go through all the red tape of getting a project and funding a project to answer this. It just becomes information that you can leverage at your fingertips.
Yeah, and I think that probably answers, Colin, your question there about what some of the main reasons why people decide to go on digital transformations and incorporate AI within their legal departments. I think that's a cast iron example of how we can work smarter using AI, faster, and meet a lot of compliance, regulatory, consistency, capability. It solves a lot of problems for us if we do it in the right way.
So one of the things I wanted to focus on, Nick, a little bit is, as people want to explore and go down these transformation journeys, what's been your feedback of actually working with, maybe touched on it a little bit, but like working with an early stage company like App Orchid, it's kind of a new way to kind of do business instead of like massive service integrator. And
yeah,
what's your thoughts about that?
So I'm torn, Mike. I want you guys to be a roaring success, but the bigger you get, for me, potentially, the smaller these benefits get. But working with a company your size, Mike, is just the agility and the speed at which you're able to take ideas and enhancements and make them real in production. It's just phenomenal. If we're working with a large, I'll drop some names, large sort of beasts, IBMs of the world, even Accentures, the sorts, what the process is like. You have to write a statement of work, and it needs to go through, and we negotiate on the statement of work, and then it's back into the procurement purchase to pay systems, and you're talking months before you even get you even start the work. But I think with the smaller company that's more agile, we see the time between having that chat or feeding those ideas in and seeing them is a lot smaller. I think the other thing is roadmap and strategy for the product. You genuinely listen to us in terms of where we'd like the tool to go and additional enhancements and features that we could do with, and that you could potentially build. I think working with the bigger you get as an organization, I think the more distant you get from being able to influence that roadmap. And I think where you guys are at the moment are massively responsive in terms of new features and the direction of the product. Quite often you'll come through to us and say, we're thinking about doing this. What do you reckon to my team? And most of the time it's yes, that's going to be a great feature. That's really going to help. But quite often not quite often, but sometimes it's We're not really sure about that. I'm not sure that's a great a great idea, but I think it's that dialogue that that is a testament to your size and to your agility, Mike, and it's been a massive factor in the success of the product at BP.
I mean, thanks, Nick. I mean, I think you keep doing sessions like this with us, and you're always going to have a hotline into App Orchid, and
Good.
I wanted to maybe I'm just going to show one quick slide here. Does that show up, Nick, for you?
Yeah, we can see it.
Just kind of just the summary, and then I want to kind of focus on a couple other things of how address kind of Colin's area about how do you get started and what does that journey look like. So just kind of a summary here. Maybe Nick, maybe you can talk about the summary. I think it's
yeah, sure. So I think we can do technology for technology's sake, because it's good, right? It's interesting to work on. It's exciting. But for me, and what I want to get across here to the folks in the room is we're getting real results here, and that's really what matters. That's really why we're doing it. We're not doing it because we want to say we use a tool for negotiations. We have real outcomes that we must achieve with the tool. First and foremost, it's reduced our contract time, like we mentioned, from average of 3 to 6 months down to just about 8 days, which is phenomenal. And it's been a real step change, both within the business and for our stakeholders, but also our legal teams as well, as they're free now to focus on the stuff that really matters. It can work. It can do the work of, I love the analogy of 1,000 10-year-olds. It can do the work of 1,000 people in parallel. And our record is 15 contracts in 1 week. We had a very late requirement in one of our emerging businesses in the wind business, BP Wind, and we just had to get 15 contracts done. Previously, we would have just thrown people and costs at that problem, but it took a single procurement practitioner a couple of hours to set those contracts up in the tool, and that's phenomenal. Given it normally took us about 6 weeks for each of those contract types, that's about 90 weeks of effort just just replaced by using the tool. We've got 200 active users of the tool in over 11 direct and indirect categories. And I do want to emphasize that point, right? Because when we started with App Orchid, it was just used to buy tech, IT, commodities, hardware, low value stuff. But what we've been able to do over the last 12 months or so is scale out to include direct categories of spend and also more complex services. So less commodity based and more services orientated work, as well as some corporate services. So we also use the tool to buy learning development services, for example. But most importantly, we've eliminated the redlining process. That doesn't exist anymore. Instead, it's been replaced with the tool. And for me, that's been probably the biggest step change. It's increased the energy of the team because, the team are free to focus on crafting the statements of work and where they can really use their expertise. And it's taken away the more mundane and sort of tedious work around the overall T's and C's. So for me, when we look at those outcomes, it's done more than we could have expected.
Thanks, Nick. I think those numbers resonate more, coming from the customer than for me to talk about them. So appreciate you highlighting that for us. Just looking here on how to close that. Okay. Still learning this tool, Colin. Colin asked, advice for a legal operations team. And, one of the things I wanted to focus on was, how does someone get started? What are some advice that you would give for folks that want to get started and start using AI or a large transformation?
So I think we need to, the most important thing is to differentiate between being a digital company and having a digital mindset and just digitizing an existing organization or your existing process. And for me, the former is very much about mindset. It's about customer first, and it's about iterative thinking and continual feedback. So, once you've got that mindset, bring in a tool like App Orchid, for example, have an idea about how it might get better, feed it back, and, you've iterated it, you've evolved it. And, for me, I think it's very important to make sure your team have that mindset rather than just going out to procure a tool and then putting it in place and then just using it and it goes stale and, it's the same tool that you had 2 years ago. Technology is changing so quickly in this market that you need that mindset in order to to make the most of the tool. So for me, the other thing I suppose is to make sure you're clear about what problem you're trying to solve. For us, it was very much around doing more with less people. There's a very clear use case. We had a bunch of people leave and we had to fill that gap, and that's what the tool has done. But as you approach the market within the legal operations space, and I think it's really important to have that mindset and be clear about what you're trying to solve. I think they're the two top tips that I'd leave you with.
Yeah, and I would say to like kind of double click on technology is changing so quickly. I mean, I think gone are the days of implementing these monolithic software platforms that take a year to 2 years to install, because technology is changing so quickly. When I was here just a year ago, that what was possible with the technology versus what's possible now, it's game changing. And if you're looking at installing things that take that are measured in halves of years or years, as opposed to weeks, you're probably missing out on the evolution of technology. And probably by the time you install it, it's going to be legacy. So I would say, I use this. And I can't coin this one as mine, but date. I think we need to date more and marry less. I think you have to. The technology just changes so quickly. I think you have to be able to be agile and the offering that you have to your stakeholders and your business to drive the optimum value. Violently customizing everything and making it so it's unable to accept new technology is something that will slow you down in the long run. So the biggest advice I can give is, like Nick said, is you have to have a problem that you're trying to solve, not a tool that you want to buy. And I want you to buy my tool. But you have to have, it has to solve a problem. You have to have that deep problem that you're looking for something to solve. So it isn't about like digitizing the environment. It's about solving problems. And I would also caution, don't digitize a legacy process. And while I'll say that, I'll use this as an example. Like, if you look at the way that things are competitively done or competitive bids have been done, for as long as I know, you basically would invite somebody to a competitive bid. You may 4 or 5 suppliers. You may share an MSA with them. They may mark it up, they may not, but you're going to focus on statements of work and pricing. And then you go through a scoring process and you down select. And then what happens is then you negotiate an agreement with that whoever won the award without any leverage. And because it was too expensive for you to negotiate 5 MSAs, 5 full contracts, and to be able to score it at that level. But by you exploiting technology now, well, when you do an RFP, you can have them fill out the contracts, the MSAs, and so award leads to, down select leads to award in a contract, not like a prolonged negotiation in a sole source non-leveraged state. So I think that's where we kind of look as, something we didn't actually really talk about. But in this day and age where nobody knows what the right price for anything is, competing more deals it's almost mandatory. As well as how you deal with like what I call incumbency disease, right? You have one large supplier that you do everything with because you have no time from the stakeholders' request other than to serve it with the incumbent. But if you can bring a challenger, in 5 to 8 days, using Nick's numbers, to the party, you can bring in a challenger to even an incumbent situation at the same time that you're talking about the requirements. So that's where you kind of look at like leveraging technology to kind of change the process. I always just encourage everybody to like look at what they have and say, how can we change this? Do we still need to do this? Can we use actually technology to do this and maybe reorder things? Like if you just look at like an RFP situation, front loading the negotiation of the contract at the very beginning. That's something that technology has enabled us to do as well, and solve the problem that we have around inflation and not understanding the true cost of products now.
I wish I'd had that advice, date more and marry less, earlier, Mike. I mean, I could have done with that 10 years ago.
Sorry about that, Nick. Like I said, we learn things, everything's changing new. So
stuff happens.
Well, thanks, Colin, for setting this up for us and allowing us to have a little bit of a chat here today. I hope everybody found that valuable.
Yeah. Hey, this was brilliant insights, guys. Thank you so much for sharing those insights and your use cases. Very, very valuable. Attendees, thank you so much for leaning in and asking those great questions. Jonathan, yes, I'll be following up afterwards with a recording for everybody. If there's any questions for the attendees, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll pass them on. I'll pass them along to Mike and Nick. Looks like we're top of the hour. I want to wish everybody a happy St. Paddy's Day. Hope you guys have a good time, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks guys.
Everyone. Thanks.
You're the best.